With this photograph, we're going to come up with some interesting and creative color effects by working with hue saturation, color balance, and blending modes. So let's jump right in. First, I'm going to zoom in on this image by pressing Command plus on a Mac, Control plus on Windows, then press the spacebar key to reposition the image so that you have all the important areas visible. The next thing that I want to do is first create a hue saturation adjustment. To do that, we'll click on the Hue Saturation Adjustment icon. Now, one of the ways that hue saturation works is that we can modify the hue simply by clicking and dragging, and it modifies all of the hues. So it changes colors in a distinct way, and each color changes differently. Well, on the other hand, we can also click on Colorize, and Colorize is pretty fascinating because what this allows us to do is to add a uniform color shift across the entirety of the photograph. Well, we can use a uniform color shift like this and a blending mode in order to come up with some pretty intriguing results. So the first step here is to create a hue saturation adjustment and then to click on Colorize. Now, it's not very important what your hue or saturation is because we'll be modifying that later, although typically with most people photographs it works better to have something that's red or orange. Next step is going to be to change the blending mode. Here we'll click on the blending mode pull down menu and choose soft light. Now with this soft light blending mode, all of a sudden we have this interesting and distinct look. In some ways I like to think of this as kind of replicating the way certain types of film looks. Here we have contrast, but the contrast is both muted and warm. Take a look at this. Here you can see that before and then now the after. And the great thing about this technique is we can then move this hue slider, add a little bit more red or perhaps a bit more yellow. We can find just the right spot. We can also work with the saturation if we want more or if we want less. And the trick with this, of course, is to simply experiment. And here we have a pretty wonderful look. The other way that you can experiment is by lowering opacity, sometimes just chopping this effect in half there, down to 50%. Here's that before and then after. Well, let's go ahead and take this back to 100 and see what else we can do. Another way that we can add to this type of color work is by creating a color balance adjustment. In order to do that, we'll click on our adjustment layer icon and then select color balance. In color balance, I'm going straight to the highlights. And what I want to do is kind of tap into this red and warm tone here. I want to add more. So I'm going to click to bring up my yellows and also bring up the reds. You can see I'm adding a bit of a glow to that background there. And I just kind of like that. I think it kind of adds this overall type of a look. Here we have that before and then after. Of course, once we start to stack up layers, you almost always want to go back to your previous layers and say, well, what would happen if I had a little bit less of this and then see what that looks like? And we can see that before and after. And again, it's intriguing. Now, so far, we've been examining how we could warm an image up with contrast and have all these interesting tones. We can create other effects as well. For example, let's turn off color balance for a moment. Go back to our hue saturation adjustment. And here, let's modify the hue. In other words, let's find a cool tone and let's increase the saturation. Next, let's click on the eye icon for color balance. Well, already just that, it gives us this distinct kind of muted, interesting aesthetic before and then after. Or we could dig into color balance. Let's double click color balance there. And then we could go into our shadows and perhaps add a little bit more of a blue and a cyan look. In our highlights, we could modify the tone or color that we're bringing in there. In this case, we're almost coming up with a cross-process type of aesthetic. If this is too strong, what you may need to do is go back to your hue saturation. With hue saturation, as you lower that, because this is really our contrast layer, you can soften the effect up a little bit. Or, of course, with color balance as well, we can then bring that back. And here you can see we're just subtly tweaking the color and modifying the color in order to come up with a distinct look. Well, at this juncture, let's evaluate what we've come up with. Here you have that before and then after. Now, the point here isn't to say process your image one way or another. Yet the point is to begin to experiment, first of all, using hue saturation on Colorize, and then change your blending mode to soft light. See what kind of color combinations you can come up with. Experiment with those warm colors by adding some red or yellows. Also lower your saturation. Find just the right spot for that and look at your before and after. You'll soon discover that this is a pretty powerful technique. Of course, experiment with each different slider amount to see how it affects your particular image. Next, add a color balance layer. And with this color balance layer, typically it's best to leave this one on a normal blending mode, but experiment with different color combinations, because sometimes you'll discover that this little added extra boost of color can make your images come to life in an interesting way. Now, if ever you're making adjustments and you feel like you've just gone too far, with these adjustment layers, you can always click this reset icon and we'll take everything back to normal. Next, go back to the area you want to modify, then perhaps add your adjustment so you can warm up those highlights there, bringing in some reds and yellows just to bring out the vividness of that color. Then finally, be sure to evaluate that before and after. Look at your image before and then after. See if you're going in a good direction. And at the end of the workflow, one of the things that I always like to do is to group my adjustments together. To do that, click in one layer, hold down the Shift key, and then click in another. Next, press Command or Control G for Group. Here I'll go ahead and name this group Color and Tone. Next thing that we can do is we can, of course, lower the opacity of the entirety of this effect. We can find just the right spot for one particular image. And perhaps with this image, just softening that to about 60%, I think looks really nice. Here's that before and then after.